So first and foremost, we got to talk about the real important stuff in life, and my condolences go out to the family of Jimmy Johnson, in particular his wife Chandra and her family, as they deal with a frankly terrible and unspeakable family tragedy, which has resulted in Jimmy Johnson's withdrawal from the Chicago street race. When I read the news, as I'm sure many of you have, I was shocked and saddened. So really, really unfortunate, and more sad news, unfortunate, and this is breaking. My condolences as well go out to the 53-year-old track worker confirmed today by NASCAR to be lost in what NASCAR describes as a medical incident while setting up the Chicago street track today. Our thoughts are with the family and friends of that precious life as well. Will NASCAR continue past this year in Chicago? It's been the big question that everyone has been asking, the question mark that hangs over the Chicago street race. NASCAR Cup Series first trip to the streets. And let me know down in the comments section below, do you think that NASCAR will run more than one race at the Chicago street course? I'm sure this will be an interesting discussion in the comments section below. And while you're down there, subscribe for more auto racing content. Uncertainty has clouded the NASCAR Cup Series' first visit to a street course race in its history, pretty much since even before this Chicago street race was announced. Well-documented political upheaval in Chicago has resulted in the mayor that brought NASCAR to Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, finding herself voted out of power before the first wheel is turned in Chicago. Pressure has been mounting from the Chicago media as well as the possible replacement of Lori Lightfoot not finding a street race appealing. Then there's the race itself. Will there be chaos? And will that chaos be created by rain? Or perhaps worse, will the race even happen in a timely manner at all if there is lightning in the area, which would delay an already freaking stupidly late 5 p.m. Eastern start time? Oh boy, howdy. But there's been all sorts of concerns about whether or not the NASCAR Cup Series drivers will be able to handle a street course race. And if they can't, and it's the wrong kind of chaos, and we'll talk about that a little bit later for NASCAR, what will that mean? Now, there are several drivers who have competed on street courses before. In particular, I'm looking at Shane Van Gisbergen in the number 91, Project 91 Trackhouse Motorsports entry as a possible spoiler this weekend, especially if the conditions are treacherous. Let's talk about all the possibilities right now. So right off the bat, before I really get into the meat and potatoes of this video, I believe that NASCAR will get a second opportunity in Chicago. Now, will it get a third? Their current contract runs 3 years, as most street course contracts do. Believe it or not, wherever there's a street course, generally speaking, especially in the first couple of contract signatures, I guess we'll say, these street races get 3 opportunities to turn a profit. I look at the Nashville street race, which has hosted IndyCar, Trans Am, and a few other notable series in the past few years. They are currently on the last year of their 3-year contract, and they won't even turn a profit, that event, I mean, until the 4th year, meaning a second contract with Nashville would have to be signed, which it may or may not be signed, for anyone involved in that street race to make a profit. So when we're looking at Chicago, and we're talking about 1 or 2 or even possibly 3 years, you might not even be talking about a profit. And when we've got politicians involved, and we're going to talk about the politicians, anything is possible. Even street races that have been successful or been at least looking like they're up on the onwards and upwards trajectory, like the street race in Baltimore about 10 years ago, they can go away the minute that the leadership of the city decides, are we really spending our money correctly? And it looks like that process may be accelerated greatly in Chicago. But I just think that and knowing a few things, and I'll tell you what I know here in just a second, but looking at the situation, I think NASCAR will get at least a second opportunity in Chicago. I already know that IMSA is looking at possibly joining NASCAR next year. I know they were on the schedule this year. I think Porsche Cup was originally scheduled to join NASCAR at the Chicago Street Race. That ultimately didn't happen. And my understanding is at least some classes from the WeatherTech Sports Car Championship are planning on joining NASCAR in Chicago next year. Of course, assuming that a second Chicago race happens, which I currently am assuming. Now, this is what's very strange about all the complaints and all the talk surrounding the NASCAR race in Chicago. Because really, if you think about it, street course racing has always, and I'm talking always, been a part of racing. In fact, the genesis, the birth of racing was street racing on the literal streets, because there were no purpose-built circuits when the first automobiles were constructed. You raced them on public roads because that was the only place to do it. And in more often than not cases, they were roads designed for horses and not for automobiles. But by the time NASCAR came along in the late 1940s, we were not looking at street course racing, especially in the United States, as a particularly viable option. Yes, it still existed, but not nearly to the extent that it had in the 30s, 20s, 10s, and early part of auto racing. It was, purpose-built tracks, whether they were dirt tracks, whether they were permanent asphalt tracks. And because of that, NASCAR's culture has not had the same culture that racing on street courses or even road courses to a certain extent has been acceptable, like Indy cars or sports cars or Formula One cars have had over the course of the years, because NASCAR is frankly younger in a lot of ways than Grand Prix racing or Indy car racing or sports car racing. It's the youngest of those four divisions of racing. And because of that, street courses were a fad, and that fad faded, and then the fad came back, but NASCAR was so big when street course racing really became a thing once again in the United States in the late 70s and early 80s, the NASCAR didn't need street courses, much like the Indy cars did. They didn't need to go to city centers because they could get 100,000 people out in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania. But things have changed over the last few years, and NASCAR at its purpose-built tracks has had dwindling attendance. A large part of that, and that's another thing we're going to talk about later in this video, is an aging demographic. NASCAR's demographics are extremely old. Even within auto racing, believe it or not, they skew extremely old. So, one of NASCAR's ideas to get the younger fans involved is to go to street tracks. This is going to be a legendary day. Or a legendary weekend, and really it already has been a legendary week on NASCAR Twitter. Some of the bad takes have exceeded my expectations already. And NASCAR Twitter, if you don't know, it's a cesspool. It's where the worst of the young fans and the worst of the old fans go to absolute war every week. It's very entertaining to watch, but I think it's going to be particularly bad this week because the older fans, I would say, on a whole, are very much opposed to street course racing. A lot of the younger fans, whether it's just because they're being contrarian or whether or not they actually want to see a street course race in NASCAR, regardless, they are very pro street racing, at least for now. And it's led to some very funny discussions, and I think it's just going to continue as cars actually hit the pavement tomorrow. One thing that I think is extremely interesting about this whole Chicago street course experiment is that one of the biggest proponents and pushers of this, and as we've seen in NASCAR, oftentimes it is the TV networks that are calling the shots on how the races are run, when the races are run, when the cautions are thrown in the race. It's the broadcasting company that's making a lot of those decisions. And so I find it very interesting that NBC has pushed this Chicago street race harder than I've seen them push pretty much any other race that they have on their platform, probably save for the Indianapolis 500 and possibly the Chase Cutoff race at Daytona, which is kind of surprising because someone should let NBC know how many street course races, IndyCar and IMSA combined, which are both on NBC, by the way, run. But I get it. It is a new event. But I do think it's very interesting, and it should be very notable for you NASCAR fans to note how in the corner of street racing NBC seems to be, especially as contract negotiations continue for the next TV contract. If NBC is significantly involved and the Chicago race is deemed to be a success, whether it is a success or not is going to come down to your personal preference. But if NBC thinks that this is a roaring success, you're probably going to see more street races, in my opinion. Now, that being said, I think negative publicity can and will hurt this event. Now, I absolutely understand that generally speaking, people want chaos over great racing in NASCAR, but there is a possibility that NASCAR can take it a step too far and it becomes bad NASCAR chaos. That does exist, and it has happened a few times the last couple of years. I think I look at Daytona pretty much every year. Daytona is the bad kind of chaos, whether the track is raining or whether it's raining on the track and they don't call a yellow, or they call too many yellows in the case of the Daytona 500 and the whole field crashes, and we get odd and strange winners. But I think if there are weird like acts of God sort of things, like long lightning delay, possibly the race having to end because of darkness, bad officiating, which means they're going to throw a yellow for every Tom, Dick, and Harry that crashes, and there's probably going to be a lot of that happening. Local yellows are not a thing in NASCAR, so the minute someone beaches it in a tire barrier, how quickly is NASCAR going to pull the trigger on a yellow flag? And if they do, the vast majority of this race may end up being run under the yellow, and that would be bad chaos, bad publicity for NASCAR. And if it's a boring race, God forbid it's a boring race. Let's say Shane Van Gisbergen just absolutely machine guns the field and runs away. Everyone's going to say, well, that sucked. Never do that again. And that, I think, will hurt the race. And on a serious note, I do think that this worker death that has just happened today, from a politician standpoint, from an opposition to the race standpoint, they've got their headline now. Regardless of how the guy passed away, it's not going to matter. They're going to say, death at a NASCAR race, and that's all they're going to need to start stoking the anti-street course racing in Chicago fires. And that's unfortunate. You hate to see that, but that's politics. People put, put their own interests ahead of the interests of, actual human dignity. I mean, that's not a surprise, right? Young fans in street course racing. This is one thing that I think is very curious because, I think it's misguided at best that for some reason young fans like street course racing better than oval racing or natural terrain road course racing. I think racing just in general has a young fan problem. And just because you say, well, we're going to do a street race now isn't necessarily going to solve any kind of an attendance or interest problem. I think it is worth noting that Bubba Wallace put on a Bubba's Block party yesterday, or that's what they called it. I think it was a McDonald's initiative. But they got 7,000 people to come out to it. And generally speaking, I think you would assume that people who are living in downtown Chicago are not necessarily NASCAR's core demographic. So I think that's good. Obviously, 7,000 fans isn't going to immediately change NASCAR overnight and make their demographics as young as, say, Formula Ones are right now. But there could be some positive that comes out of Chicago, and I think we need to not just pretend like there's no positive possibilities here. The final thing, and it's interesting because I've been looking at my viewership demographics recently, and obviously you can look up the TV rating demographics as well, but one thing that I've noticed is that my NASCAR videos, when I do a NASCAR video, the demographics versus if I do an IMSA video, an IndyCar video, a Formula One video, on a NASCAR video, the demographics skew to over, and I'm not, BSing here, over 50% of that viewership on a NASCAR video is over the age of 45 on YouTube. A YouTube video about NASCAR, 50% of that audience is over the age of 45. That should scare you if you're NASCAR. And I'm sure they've already looked at those demographics themselves. They probably have better internal data than I do. But when you look at those numbers and you think about that for a second, that means NASCAR's got 20 years, well, probably less than that if we're being honest here, to capture that young demographic. Will street course racing do it? I guess we'll wait and see. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube. Subscribe for more motorsport content, and I'll see you in the next video where we're probably going to be talking IndyCar at Mid-Ohio and NASCAR on the streets of Chicago.